Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you for another episode this week. You may have noticed that I did not preview this episode on the end of Tuesday's episode because I wasn't fully sure when it was going to go up, so I didn't want to give you false information. Again, I've done that a couple times lately just because of rescheduling things or issues with scheduling. So I am excited to have you here for a second episode. This was a week that I had 2 interviews scheduled, needed to reschedule one of them. It ended up being rescheduled for today, and I'm able to get the episode up on the same day, which is not something that happens very often for me, but it's working out today, so that's good. I hope you've had a great week. If you are in the U.S. and you are celebrating Memorial Day this coming weekend or this coming Monday, and you actually get a 3-day weekend, awesome. I hope that you have something fun planned. And of course, if you don't have a 3-day weekend, I hope that you still get a good weekend or your good time off somewhere, whatever your regularly scheduled time off is. It has only been a couple days since I last spoke with you, and it's been a very quiet week, which, if you've been listening to the past few weeks, you know is good. I'm very happy about that because we've been very busy, and I am glad to have a little bit of a break from being overly social. That makes me happy. So yeah, we've been just hanging out with each other and the puppies. So I am not complaining about that. Watching some TV, hanging out. Obviously, I've been reading and getting ready for interviews and those sorts of things, but not much to report from this side of things. My husband's probably starting to get bored, so we'll have to do something soon, or he will miss that. He will crave that social time, just like I crave the non-social time. So we do try to find a balance in there somewhere. Anyway, we of course are here to talk to an author, to talk about a book. This episode, what am I saying? I don't know. Clearly I don't know. This episode's author interview is with Victory Witherkeigh, and we are talking about her young adult dark fantasy horror novel called The Girl. That's a mouthful. Young adult dark fantasy horror. As you know, I am not a huge fan of horror when it is really, really, really scary or really, really, really gory. This one is none of those things. Neither of those things. It'll make you think, though. It's dark, and it's got moments of lightness. It's got moments of even humor, but there's definitely dark over and undertones within this story. If you have a young adult reader that loves dark fantasy or horror, then this would be perfect for them. If you're not quite so sure, you may want to read it yourself. Like I said, it's not overtly graphic or really, really, really scary, but it does have some of those darker over and undertones. So you may want to check it out first. But as I always say, you know your readers best and what they enjoy and what they will be able to handle. So, or they know what they like to read, depending on their age. They can make that decision on their own, of course, as well. So let me go ahead and give you the description of the book. Again, it is called The Girl. Did I say that? I don't remember if I said the name of the title. It is The Girl. The author is Victory Witherkeigh. It's the year 1521. A blood red moon sets the stage on the evening of April 26th on the Philippine island of Mactan. This night, famed chief Lapu-Lapu and his men discuss the terms given to them by a man, Magellan of Spain, who arrived on a large wooden ship. Lapu Lapu leads his people in a defeat of the conquistador in battle the following day by asking his village holy man to invoke the goddess of death at the price of his future generations. The girl is a descendant of this chief who led his men into battle to kill Magellan and the holy man who called upon the goddess of death. That tells you so much and also nothing at all. That is the basis of the girl's story, but there's so much more to this. And as Victory says in the interview, it's hard with a book like this because you don't want to give a lot away. So this gives you the history and the mythology on which the girl's story is based, but doesn't really tell you much about the girl, and I'm not going to either, because one, you're going to hear Victory talk about the book and the girl and the other characters in this interview, but also because, as she says, I don't want to give a lot away. And as someone who's read the book, enjoyed the book, I don't want to slip up and give you more information than you need. You should read it if this is obviously something that is of interest to you. So rather than me talking about it and giving something away, we're going to turn to the interview so Victory can talk about it, and she can give away whatever she wants because she's the author, right? Again, the book is called The Girl. The author is Victory Witherkeigh. Let's get to that interview. Hi, Victory. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, nice to be here today.
I'm happy to have you here. I'm excited to talk about your book, The Girl. Before we do that, though, if you would take a moment and just share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit, that would be great.
Sure, no problem. My name is Victory Witherkeigh. I am debut young adult author. Primarily, I write in the genres dark fantasy and horror primarily, but I do have a number of other short stories published in nonfiction and creative writing. I am originally from Los Angeles, California, and I'm a female Filipino and Pacific Islander writer and author.
All right. Is May Pacific Islander, Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month?
It is.
Okay.
Yep. Nope. You are absolutely correct. It is both Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month as well as Mental Health Awareness Month. So we get both in May.
Two very important things, and I don't know that there's necessarily a Hallmark greeting card for that, but whatever the accolades are, happy, merry, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those like happy. Usually the acronym is Happy AAPI Heritage Month, but. Or some people have just told me AAPIHM, which is just a lot of letters after a period of time. You're like, is your spell check off? I don't know what's going on right now.
You lost me. Well, two very important things, two very important pieces of history and information that we should all be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So, as I said, the book is called The Girl. Can you give an overview of that story?
So The Girl is a dark fantasy horror coming of age story, I would say, about a young brown-skinned Pacific Islander girl whose family unfortunately indicates that she may not come from the best lineage, or the other way to put it would be someone in her genealogical tree who is rather famous on our Pacific Islands made a deal with our old gods and goddesses that directly affects her. So those are kind of two spins you can have on what The Girl is about.
And what was your initial jumping off point for the story? Where was the point where you thought, I want to write about this young woman?
So the idea actually originally popped in my head when I actually started working right after college. So I was working, oddly enough, in a crisis line for mental health. And I was the manager of said crisis line. And so I was working very late hours, odd times. And I just had this thought of, as people are sort of going through the worst day or moments on these phone lines, oftentimes we as the people on the calls, we're in a position of, trying to break through what we would term the false narrative, or whatever sort of cycle or spin they were sort of in. And it was just a thought that crossed my head I just had the image of this young girl and kind of these disjointed beliefs of their low self-esteem. And that was way back in like 2010. But I just wrote the idea down. It kind of went into a journal, and it stayed there for many, many years until I would say about 2019 was when I had, finally been working over a decade. And I knew as a young kid, I had always, had I want to write a book one day dream. And it was the first time I really found in my career that I had enough savings, I guess you could put it, to sort of take the risk and try. So I told myself, I'll give myself a year, see if I can actually produce something with this. And NaNoWriMo came up, so the National Novel Writing Month of November came, and I decided to throw my hat in with that and this idea. And lo and behold, I had a very ugly first draft, but it was there. And that's sort of where it was born, was, an amalgamation of, a thought very, very, very many years ago, sitting in a journal that, I finally took the time to expand upon.
And it's interesting because of this girl's lineage. And, this is one of those books where you don't want to give a lot away. So we have to talk around
I know.
things.
I know. It's one of the hardest things. I'm like, I am so sorry. I feel like I'm like tiptoeing. I'm like trying to give enough to be like, yes, it's interesting, but I don't want to spoil it if you haven't read it yet.
Yes. But one thing that was interesting to me is that as you're getting to know this family and this girl, you're not quite sure, is that lineage correct? Is she what her parents think she is? Or does she become that because her parents forced this narrative on her for her entire life? So how is that for your writing process in terms of kind of balancing those elements?
Oh, that was huge to me. I never wanted it to feel very one-sided. I always found, as I was growing up as a young girl who was looking for literature that I could identify with, and obviously it's been in the media many times of how representation matters. And, as a brown-skinned person, often in my generation, at least, there was not a lot to identify with. But when I was reading young adult, middle grade books, I always felt a little too tilted in one direction, where it was like either the kid was absolutely the hero and the adults around them were completely insane, or, the adults were, the kid was trying to get over themselves, but it felt a little too like the parents were always right. And so especially with horror and dark fiction, I always felt like living in the gray was a point I was definitely trying to make. And especially because growing up, one of my favorite sort of coming of age or fairy tales or tales that I loved was actually Aesop's Fables. And the reason I loved it so much was because there was always that element of danger, always the feeling like, even though the adult says something, it doesn't mean it's going to be listened to. It doesn't mean people don't get hurt, or just in the same, even though there's a small child, it doesn't mean that the kid is necessarily innocent. So, I did definitely want to straddle that line of having the reader, read the perspective, and you do get an idea of where the girl's coming from. But, on the outside perspective of the family, you can kind of get this idea that, man, if this really was this lineage that had been passed along, could you fault them so much for being so harsh at times, or even, trigger warning, potentially abusive, when there's a danger that might just be living in your house, So it was a point I was very much trying to make of hopefully the reader the whole time is, kind of on their toes and sort of a little like, well, this isn't great, but also, do you not see that you might be leading them right to the door? Also the same, not just with Aesop's Fables, but even Greek mythology, how many myths are, here's the warning and the prophecy of X, and people end up doing the thing that actually just leads to that prophecy. Whereas opposed to, if you just didn't know that, or you just lived your life the way you're thinking, would you actually get there?
Right. Yeah. And that, I would imagine, maybe made the girl more interesting, more challenging to write. What about her as the main character do you think is going to resonate with readers the most?
The thing I hope resonates with readers, particularly young girls and young women, is kind of a trope that gets thrown around a lot in literature. You know, the unlikable female gets thrown a lot, and I always hated that trope as a kid, and I still hate it as an adult, because the idea of unlikability and female, you know, those two words together, and it's do you have to be likable as a person to be good? Do you know, is that really a thing? I mean, there's also in the last few years, how many examples we've had of people who were popular, but not necessarily good people. And I wanted that journey, that idea in coming of age of sort of bigger topics in YA that are more than just, oh, I like a boy. Oh, um, you know, I'm having trouble fitting in, but really kind of addressing some of the things that I know young people do go through, questioning your sense of self, your identity, how you relate to your family. I did not want something easy, you know, where the parents necessarily died off right away. You know, you don't have to deal with your family dynamics anymore because you're totally on your own. But what happens when you add in the complicated family relationships? What happens when you are trying to prove yourself, but you're not necessarily sure who that's for yet? So all these aspects of growing up that, you know, as an adult, you can look back on and kind of remember. I hope that people read The Girl and either can relate or remember those moments of, oh, I remember questioning that, or you know, the first time I really questioned authority, or I questioned what my place was in the world, or how I am supposed to fit in. And particularly in cultures such as my own and other minority cultures, you know, the idea of the dutifulness to family is so big and so massive in your psyche from a very young age that confronting a lot of these things can feel very almost like slaying a dragon, or just as intense as, you know, trying to get to your first dance.
Ooh, there's so much to unpack with that phrase, unlikable female characters. And we are going to continue this conversation, but right now it's time for the first break of this episode. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Victory Witherkeigh. Before the break, we were talking about the girl as a character and what might resonate with her character with readers. And she was talking about likable versus unlikable, especially with female characters in novels. So let's go ahead and return now to that conversation. And it's always interesting because our characters that are deemed unlikable actually unlikable, or do they simply exhibit characteristics that aren't considered necessarily feminine? Whatever.
Yeah. You know, and even the idea of a hero, right? That they're always brave, that they never deviate from mission, that they pick the right choices at all the right times. I mean, things like that I, as a young reader, thought, well, I can never do that. You know, I'm self-conscious. I would never just jump at the chance to risk myself for this thing, which made it unrelatable to me. And so I, you know, things like anti-hero or unlikable female character, where it's some of these things, well, I mean, what does likability have to do with it if they're actually trying very hard to just do the best they can, which is often a message you can hear sometimes. It's like, why is that not the message we were putting forth? But if that is not heroic, especially when against all odds, people don't expect you to do that, or you come from a background where they don't expect that at all, you know, how is that not as brave as, say, you know, standing up for the Knights of the Round Table, or, whatever other fantasy tropes have been around forever in Western centric fantasy. That is something that I think should be explored, especially with women, especially because we know that, likability for so much of our lives tends to be the primary focus. Whether you look at the research or just basic BuzzFeed quizzes, just being liked for most women is such a hard avenue to navigate, and such a hard message to get over, or to get to a place where you really accept yourself. And that's what I hope the girl kind of tackles or can help sort of plant that seed from an early age, is presenting more female characters that are more complex than just, of course I picked up this sword, and of course I did the right thing from the get-go. And of course I was perfect the entire time, and looked beautiful, and always got the guy, and, right?
Right. And I like that you say that, because as much as I like reading stories, and as a teenager liked reading stories where, a teenager was thrown into a situation and then they got through it, whether that was because they discovered powers they didn't have or strength they didn't have. I always think of myself and think, there is no way I'm getting through anything like this. Like most of us are not going to get thrown into whatever fantasy world it is and just immediately adapt.
Exactly. So, and I think even the idea that you can make mistakes, that you don't, even if you didn't pick the right thing the first time, maybe you will the second time, that you don't necessarily have to have it end with your one bad decision, because so many of us know that, how many bad decisions have we made, and we still make a life. So just the idea that, your one bad decision as a young female will destroy you forever. And yes, there are things that will be out there that, of course, go down that path, but also this idea that, can we be more forgiving for our female population of young women versus, the young boys, where it's like, of course they're going to break something and bloody themselves and end up in the ER and do all these things. They'll have scars, and that's what makes them, manly, or whatever you want to put in there as far as a trope. But, this idea that, for young girls, it's supposed to be this almost perfection pathway that they're supposed to walk to get to where they need to be it's suffocating. And frankly, it's not even remotely feasible in any way, shape, or form.
Yes.
So just the idea that I could be, or the girl could be, another voice to the fact of, of course you're not going to get it right the first time, or even the second, or maybe even the 50th.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that people who are listening have noticed that we have just been saying the girl, which is of course the title of the book, but the girl and her family, none of them have names. Everyone else in the book has names, but they do not. And I have my own theories for this, but can you talk about why you chose to leave them more anonymous and just call them the girl, the boy, the mother, the father?
Yeah, a little bit. I not to spoil too much, but yes, as I said, I was definitely influenced as a young kid by Aesop's fables and a little bit of, some of the Greek mythology stories that I heard as a young kid. And that was always the thing that helped me identify with them, was that, the boy who cried wolf could literally be any boy. It didn't matter where they were from, what kind of socioeconomic background they, the tale could transcend across time and geology and geography and everything. And so when I was first constructing her, and, as much as I sat there trying to remember my own mindset, I just, had to sort of look at even my nieces at certain ages at that point, and, how much they are playing make-believe, how much they are living in worlds that are, fantastically not our own just yet. And so I found myself reluctant to leave the titles of the girl or the mother or the father, because in some ways, I hoped that it would serve as a dual purpose. Yes, this is a character that is going through this particular story, but I also hope that it would allow readers to have a certain ability to to see their own pathway through her, or to see some of their own similar ways of thinking or feeling, because they didn't necessarily have a name to contend with, and they didn't have a, oh, well, that name sounds like X, or oh, that wouldn't really make me connect with them in a different way. Oftentimes when it is something that's more of an archetype, it can be a little more universal than just, I wrote this one character in this one book.
Sure. Yeah, it makes sense. And it's kind of the same thing. You describe the girl's characteristics, but fairly generally. So I feel like that also allows more readers to see themselves within that girl. But you do mention that she is a brown girl. And so that representation is really important. But beyond that, there's not a lot of description. So many, I feel like many girls of different backgrounds could identify with her.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, especially some of the situations she's in, because it's, there's nothing, as much as it's, oh, there could be something special, it's not necessarily special that a lot of people would deem as something they want. So it's she could be equal opportunity, really. I mean, looking at it from that perspective. But yes, I was trying in some ways to give her enough identifying features that, you could get a picture in your head, but not so much that you also couldn't put yourself in her shoes.
Yes. In terms of the story and some of the history and the myths and those sorts of things, how much or what types of research did you do for writing the book?
So research-wise for the book, a lot of it, some of these stories were, legends and myths I heard growing up as a kid in my own household. Some of them were just simple things like superstitions that my older relatives had that I, didn't understand as a young child. So a lot of the research went with me actually doing a little bit more in-depth look into, the Pacific Island mythology, how some of them connected across, the entire ocean, where those myths maybe have started from, and then obviously changed over time when you had land masses that were separating. So a lot of my research was actually just double checking, is the myth I'm remembering part of the ethos that I could call, a Filipino mythology or a Pacific Island mythology, where was this really stemming from? And it was more to make sure that, was that just my family's province that said it that way? Or was it actually something that, one section of islands would say that was the story versus, the southern section that might have changed a few characters here and there to make it more applicable to them. So that was a lot of my research there as far as, incorporating the mythology and trying to make sure that I, with over, thousands of islands to sort of sort through, a lot of it was what are the common threads I can pull? Because obviously as, people migrated across, myths changed to suit the times. So it was really trying to make sure I picked ones that still carried some of the similar threads that I heard.
Sure. Wow. That could be a rabbit hole that you could get lost down for a very long time.
It is. It's one of the things that's always funny having, written a book when it's, being on the other side of the fence now. I didn't realize until I did it just how much extra material you just have there. And it's great because you have it for future or if you need to use it again. But yeah, there was a period of time when, I just had pages and pages and pages of research around tropical plants and the legends of, because the names fell into so many songs and so many dances. And, as a kid, you think, oh, they're talking about a goddess, but then you didn't realize that now modernly that name has moved to a plant that I need to make sure I understand, maybe for a modern reader across the ocean, this name is not going to mean, a deity. It's going to be like, oh, you're talking about the flower that we're growing right there. Yeah, just making sure, okay, am I even getting the pronunciation or the spelling remotely similar, or is it just actually that dialect, may have died off already. So there's no way to verify it, which makes me less comfortable using it at times, because if I can't, double check with someone. It's sort of like, how am I going to explain that, or how am I going to use it in a way where I know it's respectful? So yeah, it does mean that there's a lot of research that ends up sort of sitting in a pile at the end, and great.
Yeah, that you want to use, but you can't cram it all in.
Yeah, no, and you realize quickly, those are details that are nice, but I mean, no one needs an exposition about, the fern growth and the types of knots that the trees have grown. As beautiful as they are, it's not really, it's not really going to help the pacing of this book.
Right. So that's research. And then how about your characters? How complete of a sketch do you have of characters before you start writing, or do you prefer to kind of let them evolve as you write? How does that work for you?
I actually found that I'm about 50-50. So some characters I knew, down to the favorite color, even in my mind, the way they wrote, like their handwriting looked is, how well they flesh out. But others who, who were supporting, but I didn't necessarily want to know their view of either the girl or the family, just because after a period of time, it's like there's only so much when you're trying to write from that odd third person. It's I don't want to tilt it to where I'm suddenly sounding like I feel sorry for someone, or I'm leaning towards the inkling of liking someone else in the characterization, just because I want that relationship to develop on the page, and I want to kind of see, okay, with the outline I have, can this person carry it through, or do I need a different character, or is there something about this character that just doesn't work? So yeah, I usually am about 50-50 in either like knowing everything about that character, or saying, let me just know the bare minimum, because I want to have my own character approach them as a complete stranger, and I want it to be a discovering things on the page moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess I'd not spent a lot of time thinking about maybe the main character encountering characters and learning those characters learning about each other, as opposed to you just knowing everything already.
Yeah. It's a different. I mean, yes, obviously there are writers who are complete outliners. They know like every single interaction that they're going to hit along the way. And I mean, this first novel, I'll be honest, it was a total pantser situation, because I had the concept, and I was just using the novel writing month as my word count goal, but I didn't start writing it with any kind of outline and any kind of view of how it would piece together until I had all the words on the pages. And then it was, oh, okay, now I can take a look back at everything I've written and see what I've done. But yeah, it was a complete pantser situation. So not so much I knew every single person and every single interaction. That was definitely not there.
Right. Interesting. It's time for our second break of this episode, but I want to go back to that conversation that we started this segment with, about female characters, likability, etc., how there are certain characteristics that we just expect from boys, especially in movies or in books that are fantasy based, or anything that was kind of action, etc., and what we expect of boys. And it just was making me think of my dad, who, when I was growing up, always said, well, 21 scars will make you a man. And he kind of said it tongue in cheek. I actually don't know where he got that phrase, and now I can't ask him, but it does make me wonder where he got that phrase. Is that something that his dad said to him, or I don't know. But as a kid, I never took him fully seriously. Like, I didn't think he was imposing some kind of toxic masculinity on my brother or anything. I always took it from kind of a funny point of view of like, well, if when I get 21 scars, then I'll be a man, ha. And I was a klutz. I am a klutz. I'm getting close to being a man, y'all. I think I need to recount, but I think I might actually be a man. I'll recount and let you know, but if I'm not at 21 already, I am very close. So as a kid, that always made me laugh. 21 scars will make you a man, and well, now I'm almost a man, and I have so many questions now about that phrase. Maybe I'll have to talk to my mom, but it's just really interesting the way we see those, gender norms. They used to be gender binaries. Thankfully now we don't have to see them quite so binary as they once were and the way many of us were raised. But like I said, I don't think he was necessarily saying it like that. If he was, I never took it like that. But just a silly story as we go to the break. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Victory Witherkeigh. What is it about YA, specifically in terms of dark fantasy and horror, that draws you to writing in this genre?
I wonder if it's actually flipped. So I actually just love dark fantasy and horror for all ages, but I find that, I remember really kind of getting the hooks in for those genres hitting me at my young adult ages. So I think that's where, when I first thought of like, who would the audience for this book be? That was the age I immediately thought of, because it just felt right. It felt like, okay, this was the book that I would have wanted to have around as a kid. And so I said, while I think adults could appreciate it from a completely different perspective, I definitely think I gravitate more to young adults in terms of a reading audience, because I just like the way that the demographic is a forcing function for accessibility. So it's I try to up the thoughts about, where the plot's going and what's going on, and, new ways to do things. It's just a nice challenge mentally when you're writing, knowing that you're hitting an audience that's a little younger. So, even scenes where I was like, is this a little too dark, trying to figure out ways to imply things rather than just outright state, oh, and this happened, this was awful. And, having to write the violence as opposed to like implying it's there can oftentimes be the scarier function. So I find that, writing for young adults or writing for kids, there's just a joy in it. And especially when you can see them first discovering the intensity of, that adrenaline rush and the, oh no, what's going to happen? I need to figure it out. I need to figure out what's going to happen. I remember, that feeling as a kid. So it definitely inspired I'd love to always write for this demographic in some shape or form.
Mm-hmm, sure. Is there a sequel? Because it could go either way with the ending.
It could. And, I will say, yes, there is more to the story. Now, whether I end up telling it in what medium is the bigger question. So, yes, it could definitely be read in either direction, and that was the point. But yeah, it's the awkward things, and the like, yes, still trying to figure out how to announce that part, but yes, right. There is more to it.
Okay. So I'll just leave it there and not make you try
I know.
try to explain while not explaining.
Yeah.
Yes. So is that what you're working on now? Are you working on a different story? Are you taking a break? What's going on with your writing right now?
So yeah, I am working on some of it for that. And then I'm also, I have a picture book that I'm, currently querying as well. So it's a bit of a smorgasbord as far as, what is the next project and what do I want to do next? And some of it really is like, I end up doing the project regardless. And then it's sort of after I finish it that I go, okay, I have the thing now, and then I'll see if there's an audience for it. But for this year, for 2023, I know that I had one short story released. I believe it was mid-April. And then I am expecting a second one to actually go up on podcasts. So I've actually had a bit more in the podcast market come about as far as acceptances go, which is actually really cool, because it's one thing to see your story in print, but to actually hear people's voices put next to the characters in audio format is a completely different experience as a writer. Just because, the acting involved with it and the music and the sound effects they put in kind of reminds me of the, old radio programs that my grandmothers would watch or listen to when I was a kid, not watch. But yeah, that feeling of suspense is completely different when I'm not staring at it, but I'm hearing it.
Yeah. Well, and I would imagine as the writer, you get so immersed in it that your perspective is pretty focused because you wrote it and rewrote it. And then to hear other people put their voices and their inflections and tones into it would give you a new insight even into your own writing.
Yeah, it's definitely surprising. The first time I had it happen, I remember hitting play and then sort of closing my eyes, even though there was no visual, but I was just so nervous to hear the words and go, oh man, this is going to be terrible right now. But, halfway through, I was like, there was always more the suspended disbelief. Like, I wrote that? I had to open the document and be like, I did write that. Wow, that sounds great in audio, where it's like, oh, okay, that actually works.
That's awesome.
Because as you said, you get so immersed in, especially when you get to the revising points, like you are rereading your stuff so many times that, it's almost inundated in your brain, and then you want to forget it as soon as possible. So it is nice when, by the time it gets through the production line and it's been so many months or even years for some of these stories, and it's finally out there and you're going, oh, wow. Oh yeah, that's not so bad. Okay. I feel good. I feel good.
That's good. You mentioned earlier that you knew from an early age that you wanted to write a book. So what was the final impetus that made you say, yep, this is the time, I'm going to do this and try to get it out there?
I think I had it was the first time, I hit my 30s and I got to a place in my career where I wasn't necessarily, or I was very lucky and I wasn't really struggling paycheck to paycheck anymore. And so that was really the first time, I even sat back and looked at the jobs I had, and I was going, someone asked me, do you like what you do? And that for so long, that question never came up. It would say, why like? But yeah, I had a really good friend who asked me, and I said, I don't know if I've ever considered that. And when I said that, they're like, well, what would you want to do? And the writing thing came up because I was always journaling. I always had a notebook around. I always had a ton of pictures and then writing on the back of what used to be print photos, those sorts of things. So yeah, when it was if I could do it, the question of, what if you could do anything and money didn't matter, the writing job came up. So then it became a question of, well, now that I know that, can I really just go back to work and pretend that I don't know that? Or do I actually try and see where this would go? And I chose the second option. I, very much a believer in if we really only get to do this one time, I would really like to get to the end and not feel like, oh man, I wish I had known what would have happened if I picked that fork in the road.
Mm-hmm. Would you then have advice for someone who was thinking they too would like to write a book?
Yeah. So when I get asked this question a lot, the first thing I usually say is, when you say you want to be a writer, what does that look like to you? So some people, it's I want to see my book in a brick and mortar store, excuse me. Others, it's I want to sell X number of copies. Some of it's I just want to know I can finish writing the book, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to win awards. So that's usually my first thought is, in your mind, what does a writer look like? And if so, if you can get to that place, then it's all right, how will you feel if that doesn't happen is the next question I usually ask. So it's what will happen to you if you don't win the awards, if you don't finish the book, if you don't sell 1 million copies, if you're not on the New York Times bestseller. And the reason you have to ask that of yourself is because the hardest thing about being a writer is knowing that the real journey or the real accomplishment is actually finishing the idea or getting through the story. But everything after that, whether it's, you get the 6-figure publishing deal, whether you do indie press, whether you self-publish, so much of that is sometimes out of our control, as well as the, sale numbers in general. I mean, all of that, you can do your best foot forward, you can do all the check boxes, and even then you have no guarantees that, it's all gonna be a big splash, a small splash, no splash. So, it's about understanding what your goal is, what you think writing is, what you think being an author is, and then also understanding, what risks are you willing to tolerate and not tolerate. Because if your goal really is to sell X number of things, part of me will always be like, well, there's a number of other products that are easier to sell than books, statistically speaking, which is sad, but also unfortunately a fact.
Well, but it's important to go in with your eyes open and know that it's not going to just be easy.
Yeah. And I mean, even, the follow-up is, what's the hardest part? And I said, honestly, the physical act of writing. It's even when you have the half-baked idea, you don't know where it's going. It's as we discussed earlier, having the discipline to sit there and force the function of typing the words. And some people, maybe they're not great typers. I'm like, there's also voice memos. There's a number of audio tools now that you can try to, dictate most of it and then go to clean up later. But yeah, the actual forcing function of writing is the hardest part of it.
Mm-hmm. In terms of reading, you mentioned that you've always liked dark fantasy and horror for yourself, but when you take the time to read for yourself, is that your go-to genre? Who are your go-to authors? Just what do you like to read in your spare time?
It tends to be my go-to genre. Some of my favorites are, but varieties of medium. So Neil Gaiman's The Sandman comics from DC, one of the biggest influences on my life and writing I can point to. There's an Australian author, Garth Nix. He has the Abhorsen series, also dark fantasy. Love it. You can't. There's another author who's actually known more for his science fiction, I would say, than his horror books. But his name was Ian M. Banks, and his two, horror novels that I read as a younger kid. So that would have been The Wasp Factory and The Crow Road. Were terrifying in a way that I was completely not expecting. So as a writer, one of the things, another piece of advice that you're always given is you have to be just as much of a voracious reader as you are a writer, because you learn that way. You see different points of view, different perspectives of things. So I do read within the genre I write for, but I do also try to take friends' recommendations for books as well, because I don't want to get so in my own genre that I won't read anything else. But it also gives me a funny perspective when, my girlfriends give me a romance novel and the entire time I'm reading it, and I'll point out passages in there and I'm saying, this is really creepy behavior. You realize, like, all I have to do is point out that in real life, if this person was doing that, I would be calling the police and calling them a stalker. And they're like, don't ruin I'm like, I understand that this is the fantasy agreement you've made when just like when people read my stuff, they don't expect to open it and get, mushy.
Right.
Details, but it's just funny sometimes when, we sit in our, my girlfriends are readers as well, so I'll ask them for recommendations. And yeah, when they're in the romance pit, it's often funny to hear us go back and forth about I'll read it. You just realize that I'm gonna poke holes in it because that's what I do. And they're going, oh, just don't tell me because I don't want to lose the like, oh, feeling I get when I'm reading it. I'm like, that's fine. But yeah, that tends to be one of the easiest genres that I'll pick up and read it just to see what they're reading. But the whole time I'm definitely the girl who's like, that would be a stalker. No, no, you wouldn't just do that. Why wouldn't you tell your friends where you're going or that you're just going to follow this person in the rain? Where are they taking you? How do you know?
Right.
Yeah, all the things.
Well, maybe your next task is to write a book that is that romance, but with the dark horror, but not make it seem like it's either of, I don't know. I'm just thinking.
I know, right? I know. It's one of the things that I mean, I do say as something I personally try to take as a writer is to try different things that scare me. So things that I don't necessarily feel comfortable with. And romance is definitely one genre that I'm like, I don't know how I'd write that. But because of that, I do have ideas of, what an overall concept would be. And now it's just okay, how would I do that, but still keep it creepy? Can you do a creepy romance? And I like to think so because you have examples like, you have, you have cartoons and movies and TV that show it a little bit better, but you have like Wednesday, that TV show with Tim Burton that just came out on Netflix. And that to me was just an preeminent example of what I love about the genre because it still had the quirky funness, but Wednesday still sounded and felt like the Addams Family and what you would expect of that family.
Right. Yeah. You know what? Victory talking about Wednesday reminds me that I haven't actually finished that series and I need to go back and do that because I was enjoying it. It came out at Christmas time, right around, what did it come out? End of Thanksgiving, end of November, 1st of December. And I was, smack in the wanting to watch Christmas movies portion. But now it's almost June and I still haven't finished it. Okay, putting that on my list of things to do. Ooh, maybe over the long weekend. Not that it's a long weekend here, but you know what I mean. I could pretend it's a long weekend here and finish Wednesday. But let's finish this episode first. Time for our final break, and when we come back, the conclusion of this interview. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Victory Witherkeigh. Well, how about internet presence, website, any social media people can find you on, all of that good stuff?
Yes. So I do have an author website. It is just victorywitherkeigh.com. On there, you can find my Facebook page, Instagram, and TikTok. And so I have all three accounts. They are all variations of Victory Witherkeigh. So some of them just have a dash in the middle or an underscore or are a period in between. But everything is under my author name. So hopefully you can just type in Victory Witherkeigh and find me online.
Sounds great. Thank you. Victory, we've talked about a few different topics today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to highlight at this time?
The one thing I would say is that my latest short story was released in April this year with the Underdog Press. It is called The Witch and the Widow, and it is available on Amazon. So feel free to pick it up. And other than that, you can sign up for my newsletter for any other publishing updates or fun things. The Girl, for instance, the last note I had on it was that it actually won third place for YA thriller at the Bookfest Awards for spring 2023.
Oh,
so that was that was a really nice surprise considering it, debuted in December. So I wasn't really expecting any kind of news like that. So when I got the email, I think I just sort of screamed out loud for a good minute and maybe, half cried, fainted in that process. But it was a nice like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's
what
awesome.
is happening?
What about the podcast version that you were talking about? Where can people find that?
So I will have a short story coming up on CreepyPod, and it is, as it sounds, CreepyPod. They have not told me yet when they're releasing it. I just know that I'm on the dock for voice recording, but there will be a short story of mine that will be released sometime this year on the CreepyPod podcast.
Okay. And I'm assuming, I would imagine you would announce that on your website when it comes out.
Yeah. So it'll be on my website, and then I'll make an announcement on social media as well. It's like I said, it's always the fun thing, and you get an acceptance, but then you have to wait for the date, and so it's always like, wait, can I talk about that yet? Yes, I can talk about that.
Yes. Victory, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and you taking the time out of your day to talk to me about the book and writing. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again to Victory for joining me to talk about The Girl and not talk about The Girl because we didn't want to give too much away. If you are intrigued, you should definitely check this out. If you or a reader in your life is a fan of dark fantasy, of horror, of really interesting and complicated and not at all black and white characters, then you should definitely check this out. I mentioned my dad earlier, but I was also thinking about my youngest niece during this interview. She's been on the podcast before. She's the one, if you've heard those interviews, where she has helped me. She loves to write and she loves to tell stories and she loves to read. But just the other day I was talking to her and her mom, my sister, asked her to tell me the story that she had been making up the night before while they were all hanging out, and she made up a story that was about a guy who ended up in a magical kingdom. So, seems like maybe your typical fantasy, but this was not your typical fantasy, because the reason that she initially brought it up was the guy was frustrated and he kicked a tree, and the tree kicked him back. And so then she made a joke about a Yelp review. This guy was going to give the Magical Kingdom 0 stars for a Yelp review, but the tree kicked him back and then he ran away screaming. And that was the theme of her fantasy story, was that every time he turned around, something happened and then he ran away screaming, and then something else would happen and he would get scared and run away the other direction, and then he would get scared and run away screaming in the other direction, she said. And her mom said at one point, well, is somebody magical with magical powers going to come along and help this guy in the magical kingdom? And she said, nope, that's just the whole point of the story, is he just keeps getting scared and running into things that he doesn't understand and then running away screaming. And that's what I was thinking as I was talking about when I would read fantasy as a teen, or when I read fantasy as an adult, and I think of myself at whatever age the protagonists are in the story. How would I have reacted to being put into that magical kingdom, or the urban fantasy, or finding out that I had magical powers, or whatever it was? I would probably constantly be running away screaming because of all the things that I was running into. So the Niecy Poo really captured her auntie and how her aunt would react to being put into a fantasy story at any age, probably. So good job, niece. And I told her she should write that story down so that when she is a published author sometime in the future and somebody is interviewing her on whatever podcasts morph into in the technology of the future, and they ask her, do you have the stories that you wrote when you were in elementary school or middle school, or high school, what have you? And she can then say yes. So hopefully she's writing it down. Hopefully she'll send it to me because I want to read it. And I mean, I heard her tell it, but as she fleshes it out maybe a little more, I definitely want to read it. At any rate, I just had to share that story with you. Thank you, though, to Victory for sharing her story with us, for writing a story, for coming on the podcast to talk about that story, for doing lots and lots of research to make that story come to life, for sharing mythologies that we don't always encounter, right? The Greek mythologies, the Roman mythologies, even some of the Norse mythologies we know so much more about than some stories from the islands, from Pacific Islanders, from their mythologies, from their history, from their past. We don't know those as well. And so I really like that we talked about this during Asian American and Pacific Islander month in May. We're almost done with May, but I think that timing was perfect, even though this interview was scheduled a million years ago. But I love the timing. As I said, if you are a fan of this genre, or you have a reader in your life who's a fan of this genre, definitely check it out. Please know what your child likes to read before you just give them a dark fantasy, though. You know that. I don't have to tell you that. But please check this out. I hope that you will join me next time. I have a returning author coming back. This will be her third time on the podcast. Kelly Z. Riley will be joining me again to talk about Counterfeit Commoner and Reluctantly Royal. Love the alliteration in both titles. Those are the next two books in the series that she has been talking about on her first 2 times on this podcast. So join me for that as I speak with Kelly. I always enjoy when she comes on the podcast. Hope you had a great week. It is Friday. Hope you've got something fun planned for the weekend, regardless of whether you get a 3 or a 2-day weekend or a 1-day weekend. You know, I always say that, as part of that weekend, hey, if you have a moment and you have not done so already and you would like to help me get this podcast out to more listeners, you can do a few things. I've said this before, but if you haven't done them, you can write a review or leave a starred review. Helps greatly. You can also follow, subscribe, whatever the platform allows you to do that you listen to this podcast on. You should do that because then you'll be notified when there are new episodes, especially episodes on Friday that pop up sometimes as opposed to the usual Tuesday. And finally, you can follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Love hearing from you. If you're new to this podcast, maybe you want to follow the podcast on social media. If you're new, welcome. If you've been here forever, thank you for sticking around. Thank you for letting me talk to authors and share those interviews with you. I really, really appreciate it. And as always, whatever you have going on in your life between now and the next time I bring you another episode, I hope that you find plenty of time to get yourself lost in whatever genre of good book you love best. Talk to you soon.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.